Welcome back. This is the second video that you should have received for this week, week one. And in this video, I want to give an introduction to the basics of political theology. This is the historical theology of church and state. And I think we should probably begin with the question, is there a history of church and state? For those of you who are familiar with history, especially in the Western Hemisphere, you would know that this bifurcation of church and state is something that's actually relatively new. And yet there has been quite a bit written on the relationship of church and state. But we have to realize that they're not necessarily always, well, quite frankly, they haven't always been separate spheres, but there's been a close intermingling of church and state. And so the "and" of church and state can mean a lot of different things. And we will get into that as the course goes along through the semester. Once again, thank you for being here. I apologize for not being able to be live with you. I look forward to doing that next week. But in this video, I will be introducing, first of all, the task of this class, and I will share my PowerPoint here. And we want to look at, first of all, Roman numeral 1 here. All right, this is, I try to give a summary of what each lecture is. So this would be week 1, Church and State, the basics. I want to introduce the field of political theology, and I want to describe the task and scope of our study together this semester. Let's look at the task, and there are actually a couple of ways to state this. This is the first way. I believe that our task is to analyze the political implications of Christian theology through historical study. We'll see that there are different approaches that we could take to this topic of church and state. We are going to be taking a historical approach, and through the lens of history, analyze the political implications of Christian theology. Now, before I share another way of phrasing this task, let me point out that the classic languages, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, they don't have a word for state. The polis is a word that we translate sometimes as state, but we will need to get into perhaps the specifics of what is meant by that. In fact, it's not a bad idea to actually begin a glossary. I've begun a glossary. I did not include it in the syllabus. Perhaps when I'm finished with it, it will be. But that's one of the things we want to do this semester is actually make sure that we're carefully defining our terms. That includes the word polis, which it will come up over and over again, and of course the English word politics as well. We'll get to that in a moment. But another way of phrasing the task that we want to give ourselves is this: to see how Christians have understood and practiced the political implications of Christian theology. That is our historical task, and there's plenty to draw from in Christian history, and we want to do that. Now let me share this little graphic here. This is I want throughout the semester to take this little start of a graphic, a spectrum, and begin to fill this in. So you'll probably see something like this again. It may be a little more complicated than what this one is, but when it comes to understanding political theology, there are many extremes, and at the ends of the spectrum are those who would see church and state as radically isolated from one another, that they ought to be radically isolated from one another, and their efforts and their ethic would be enacted toward that end. On the other end of the spectrum is something like Reconstructionism, which we'll talk about as the course goes along. And that is more or less a peaceful or hostile, in some cases, takeover of the state by the church. That call has certainly been made in years past and is not it's not unheard of today either. So there's a great spectrum. Those are the extremes. Church has nothing to do with state. State has nothing to do with church. Reconstructionism, the church needs to take over the state and infiltrate all levels with Christian politicians, and that will cure our ills. Well, as Chuck Colson said in his book, Kingdoms in Conflict, that won't cure our ills, and we need to have a better Christian theology than either of those extremes offer to us. And so that, in relation to our task is, what are the other options? We don't want to be an isolationist, and we're not going to fall into the pit of Reconstructionism. There are many other names for that as well, but that is one of the early names for another extreme. Let's talk about some delimitations to this course. And the first one is, as I've already been talking about, church and state. And I raised this one because really it could be argued, and is argued, by Oliver O'Donovan, a British political theologian, ethicist, well regarded, highly regarded. And he would argue that really this juxtaposition that we have in America is actually quite an American thing. 1791, the adoption of the Bill of Rights, that First Amendment that we should know well, it marks a change in the relationship of church and state in human history. And I do not think that he is necessarily wrong in that. That's certainly a major point in the history of church and state. But some would say, well, there is no history of church and state prior to that. Well, I think that would be a hard argument to make, and yet we can certainly say that the juxtaposition that has happened since then is unique. But we do want to go back into time farther than 1791. And when we do that, we are not always talking in neat terms of church and state, but more generally, and we are talking about political theology. And so the original title of this course actually was Political Theology. We changed the name to Church and State for various reasons, but I'm going to use that pretty much synonymously. When I say church and state, or when I say political theology, I more or less mean the same thing. So this is, so we are talking about the life of the church. We're talking about the public life that we have as citizens. And in this course, we are going to be constructing a Christian political theology. There are other types of political theology that Jews, for instance, would have. The Islamic faith would have a particular political theology, or variations of political theology, as would other cultures and other religions. And it's not entirely meaningless or out of the ballpark entirely to take a look at what other cultures, how they understand political theology, especially in light of mission work that takes place in those cultures. So that's not irrelevant to our study, but we're not going to spend a lot of time in that. In fact, I don't intend to get into anything other than Christian political theology in this course, and so we want to limit our topic to that. The other thing is we're going to talk about politics as it regards theology, and theology as it regards politics. And we want to understand how it is that Christians have, and therefore how we ought to live out our theology in the public square. Let's talk about methodology for a moment. There are different ways that we could approach church and state. We could take a thematic or a systematic approach where we are dealing with perhaps themes within this broader topic, or we could take an historical approach, which is generally what we will do in this class. I'm actually trying to choose a middle way. I am a systematic theologian. I do have some background in historical theology as well, but I'm going to try to navigate a middle way, and that means we are going to have, as you can see in the syllabus, somewhat of a thematic progression, and yet we are going to study those themes as they arise in history. For the most part, we'll be able to do that. And each week I try to tackle something that will fit in chronologically. So I'm going to try to balance between these two. The second point of methodology would be this has more to do with how I'm going to conduct the class. You may be accustomed to just pure lecture, or perhaps something that's more reflective, what I call reflective, discussion driven, maybe textbook driven. And in this class, again, I'm going to try to strike a balance, perhaps more so than what I have in other classes where I pretty much give lecture and that's it, with maybe a little bit of discussion. And this one, I want to try to prepare at least a 30 to 40 minute lecture for each week, but have time for us to work through some of the texts and to reflect on the reading that we are all doing together, and to point out some of the critical principles in order for us to draw out principles for our own development of a political theology. And so I want it to be reflective as well as instructive. You will see in the syllabus, I know I've already made a video on the syllabus, but there are optional assignments, and I want you to just pick and choose from those optional assignments and choose a variety there. That's for your benefit especially. And then I want us to really be focused in, to really home in on political principles, theopolitical principles as we encounter them. So for instance, I'll mention several different people, some who are writing at more of a popular level, others like Oliver O'Donovan, who are much more academic. And it's sometimes easier to pull out a principle from someone who's writing at a popular level than it is from someone who's deeply academic. But wherever we're drawing from, I want us to pull out some clearly stated principles. And let me give you an example. Chuck Colson, very strongly in his Kingdoms in Conflict. Later, the later printing is called God and Government. But I believe it's maybe in chapter 20 or somewhere in there, where he is very certain that pastors should not be politicians. That is, we should not be running for office, those of us who are pastors. That there needs to be a clear distinction, clear divide between the pastoral office and public office. And that may be something that you agree with. It may not be. We will look at some of his rationale. He's not highly academic, so he may not work through all of the rationale behind that. But that would be an example of a theological or political principle that you might want to integrate into your own personal theopolitic. And then let me give you some definitions here. Definitions are so crucial. They will be crucial throughout this study. Again, I would encourage you to maintain a glossary of terms. I have started building my own glossary of terms over the last few years as I get into a field of study and really get into it. I have found that it's so important to understand what the definitions are, or what the range of definitions are, because for many of these words, you will come across different definitions, and maybe they're complementary, maybe they're not. Maybe one takes you in one direction quite narrowly, maybe one steps back and gives you a much broader picture. But let me just begin with theology. I am a systematic theologian. I'm offering you my definition of theology. That is, there are two parts here, so we can break this down, but I'm just giving this to you now. It is the interpretation of God's self-revelation, and that's followed by the organization of that interpretation into a system of belief and ultimate explanation of reality. And I would endeavor to say that whether a person is a believer or not, that is, whether a person is a theist or an atheist. We all work with similar data, and we have to interpret that. And as Christians, as theists, we interpret that data as part of God's self-revelation, and we organize that into our system of belief and ultimately our explanation of reality. Now, let me digress here just for a moment. You may or may not be familiar with what I call the ways of knowing. We're delving into a little bit of epistemology here, and I bring this up because of this definition of God's self-revelation, and we need to be aware of the ways of knowing. So let me just share these real quickly with you. How do we know what we know, or what we think we know? We know many things through what's called empirical knowledge. That is through our senses, our experience. Our five senses would be included in this, our experiences that we have in life. We gain empirical knowledge through those things. We gain knowledge through logic. We call this rational knowledge. We may never see something, but we may be able to understand something that's microscopic simply because of logic. Science, there is scientific knowledge, and of course, many of these sometimes are blended into a single act of, I just made reference to something that's microscopic. So when you're looking at something through a microscope, you are actually employing multiple ways of knowing in those moments: sensation, logic, scientific method. Then there is history, which we will be doing in this class, which gives us historical knowledge. Now, what's important about these ways of knowing is that there are different criteria for what counts as knowledge within these different ways of knowing. And so it would be inappropriate, for instance, to employ the scientific method to other ways of knowing. They may overlap, that you may use them simultaneously. You may be looking through a microscope again, and you're seeing something empirically. You can deduce some knowledge from what you have experienced before. That's logic. And of course, you're using a scientific method here of observation and watching for repeatability and falsifiability. But history especially stands out a bit in that it does not neatly fit all of the criteria that would be applied, perhaps, say, to science. History and historiography has a set of guiding principles that are particular to historical research. And that's true for all of these. And then finally, there's intuition, or what we might call justified basic beliefs. In other words, there are some things that we believe, and we really can't tell anyone how we know that those things may be true. And you will notice here that I'm using two keywords, knowledge and belief. And they both deserve perhaps a lecture on their own. But I would say, first of all, these are ways that we know something. And when we know something, from that knowledge, we develop beliefs. But it can also work the other way around also. We can believe something, and from that belief can actually lead us then to learn something that we call knowledge. So it can work both ways. There's a lot of material on epistemology and how it relates to faith. That's not what this class is about, but we need to be familiar with the ways of knowing and locate what we're doing in this class. And that is, we are especially interested in this fourth one, that is history. Now let's continue with definitions. As I mentioned, the classic languages of Hebrew, Greek, and Latin do not have a word for state, but this word polis is used as the foundation for our English word politics. And it can be defined in this way: the ordering of common life for human flourishing. the ordering of common life for human flourishing. That's one definition that's given in one of the political handbooks that I have. Here's another one. This one comes from Scott and Kavanaugh's Wiley Handbook of Political Theology, one of the most esteemed handbooks on political theology. Well worth the purchase. It is expensive, but they define it this way, and this definition is referenced many other places as well. They say political theology then is the analysis and criticism of political arrangements from the perspective of differing interpretations of God's ways in the world. So you can imagine that you take two very potentially inflammatory topics, politics and theology, and you put them together, and it may seem to be quite an explosive combination, and indeed it can be. Hopefully not in this class. Hopefully we can reason through some of these things very calmly and critically. But when you bring these two things together, a lot of things can happen, and we want to maintain our analysis and criticism in a good way of both politics and theology, that intersection. Here's another way, and this is just my lay way of putting it. That is the study and practice of Christian ethics in the public sphere. It is what, again, asks the question or seeks to answer the question, what are the political implications of our theology as Christians? That should be one of our guiding questions. Political theology, I will go into a little bit of the history in the next lecture, but I want to point out that political theology really refers to three different ideas. One is that political theology is a concept. I've tried already in the definitions and already through this lecture to try to build a concept of how politics and theology might intersect. That's a concept that we're talking about. But political theology is more than that. Political theology is also a movement. There's a long history here of what political, I say a long history, longer than I've been alive, but there is a modern movement that is called the political theology movement that is really a post-World War II movement that began in Germany, and we'll talk about that in the next lecture. But it's very, very important. If you ever find yourself in discussion, or as you read, for instance, Elizabeth Phillips, she'll introduce you to this, and you may be a little taken back that she is not beginning in America. Well, that's because political theology, properly speaking, was first a movement that used this phrase, political theology, and quite frankly, is often identified closely with the liberation theology, which it kind of gave birth to liberation theology that we may be familiar with in Latin America. That all grew out of that German school of thought. And then political theology is ultimately a practice. It's a political, a theopolitical ethic. It is, as I mentioned before, how we live out the political implications of our Christian faith. Now, there are some guiding questions that I want to guide our study. One of them, I'll just share, I think, three of them here with you. One is there a social order politic in nature? Is this something that is man-made, or is this something that comes from what we may call natural law? Does nature itself create hierarchies that we might be able to identify as a sort of politic? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. We'll certainly ask that question. Again, natural law comes into effect in this question as well. From where are rights derived? Rights and politics intersect all the time, and especially in modern democracies such as the United States experiences, That's a big issue, this idea of rights. Well, where do our rights come from? At one point, most of the world rights, they believed that rights would come from the monarch or from the person who was ruling. And then John Locke comes along and says, no, actually rights are given to us by God and are revealed to us in nature. And so he appeals to natural law. And then we have to ask the question, what ultimately is our Christian responsibility to others? That's really what we want to bring everything down to in the end as we construct our own personal political theology. We want to construct a theopolitic that is an ethical statement, or a series of ethical statements of what we believe is an appropriate way to behave and to carry out our Christian responsibilities in the life of others in our public life. And then really, when you think about this and you think about God's word and how to boil everything down to perhaps some simple truths, Jesus did that for us when he said, the first commandment is to love God with all your heart. The second one, which is equal to that, is to love our neighbor as ourselves. And in the end, that's really what political theology is about. How do we love our neighbor? And so I thank you for coming on this journey with me as we learn together, because this is what we want to learn how to do better. So with that, thank you for joining us, and I will go into the history of the political theology movement in the next lecture, and we will begin with some recent history and then go back all the way back to some classic Greek philosophy and work forward. God bless you, and thank you for watching.